Hi there, YouTube. So, yeah, I'm gonna need you to go ahead and like this video. And if you could go ahead and subscribe to the channel too, that'd be terrific. Presenting the No Homework Book Club. We are covering Mike Cohn's Agile Estimating and Planning. It's gonna be a good one today, short and sweet. This is going to be Chapter 5, Estimating in Ideal Days. And this is a technique that, well, I don't think I've ever formally used. Well, I know I haven't formally used it. I think I may have inadvertently used this before, just kind of informally. But let's go through the presentation and show you what estimating in ideal days is all about. And then we'll kind of talk about final conclusions at the end of things. So let's jump into it. Estimating in ideal days. It's going to be a short one, like I said. We're going to go through football, interruptions, and estimating in ideal days. Let's check it out. American football! So how long is a game of American football? There's a couple of ways you could think about that. You could say that it has 4 15-minute quarters and is therefore 60 minutes long. Or you could say that it's somewhere around 3 hours long. Both of these are accurate ways of describing the football game. Right? And these are two different ways of thinking about estimating the time. Ideal time is really, it's the amount of time that something takes when you strip off all of the peripheral activities. So in that sense, it's like thinking that the football game takes 60 minutes. That's the actual amount of time on the clock. You know, I think about also when you're working hourly, you know, you go to take your lunch break. That's not counting towards your 8 hours in the day. You know, you're off the clock for that kind of stuff. Elapsed time, on the other hand, is the amount of time that passes on a clock, or perhaps a calendar. So in this sense that the football game, we're thinking it takes 3 hours of elapsed time. That's the actual time that it's going to be taking, including all of the extra stuff. And Mike Cohn makes a point in this chapter. He says, look, when you go to the programming guide on the television, it shows you that the football game's on from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And clearly someone at the network has been able to make a prediction in the elapsed time. After years of doing it, they'll be able to kind of like add extra commercials, maybe remove commercials if there's injuries or a lot of timeouts, things like that. We know that the football game is scheduled to end at 4 o'clock, and it's only an estimate. People aren't shocked when the game ends at 4:15, which is an overrun of 8%. You know, you could be frustrated or annoyed, but you're not going to be totally surprised. And he makes a good point here. Why then are we surprised when a software project estimated at 12 months takes 13, which is an equivalent 8% overrun? Which one of those do you think actually seems harder to estimate? And another point here that I would point out is one of the reasons why a football game is so accurately estimated in its actual ideal time is because football games happen all the time. They happen over and over and over again. All right, so there's a big difference between estimating how long something is that you have done repeatedly many times before and you have historical data to look at, versus when you're doing something, a software project. It could be a rinse and repeat kind of a thing, but very likely it's going to be a unique scenario that you've never done before and your team has never done before. And in those cases, you don't have the predictability of historical project data to look at, in which case the margin of error in your estimate is going to be a lot higher. All right, so what are the things that we actually strip out when we're getting ideal days? It's largely interruptions. So these are some things that lead to overhead, right? You've got like interviews, phone calls, one-on-ones with your manager. You gotta deploy to production. You gotta put out fires in various environments. You got all these emails that you're expected to read and know exactly what's going on when you get 100 emails a day. You can get sick. You got to go to these really exciting meetings all the time. All of this stuff you're supposed to do, and then also develop software, right? And on top of that, to make matters worse, you've got the Michael Jordan effect, which is where, oh, you're working 60% capacity on critical project A. Can you go ahead and just also work on project B at the same time there, please? That would be terrific. So, yeah, that's way more common than you would think. I'll put it out there that some people like that, actually. However, there's probably something wrong if you're not being able to dedicate yourself wholly to a project and really just kind of run with it. There's probably some issues there, like the project is start and stop for various reasons, typically related to dependencies on other teams or dependencies on third parties, the usual culprits there. So let's look at estimating in ideal days. It's really not too crazy. It is an expert estimate. When estimating in ideal days, you want to assume the story being estimated is the only thing you're working on. Okay, so it's just solely focusing, running it from start to finish. Everything you need is on hand when you start, and there will be no interruptions. Okay, so that's what you want to do. I'm going to make a comment here that, I don't know why you would do this, because this is never going to happen. This is absolutely never going to happen. So you're basically planning on having a completely unrealistic situation going on. But I think the point is let's look at the core work, and let's maybe compare that to the actual time it takes. The other thing that you want to do is to make sure that you have a single estimate for a user story. Don't have a bunch of broken down individual estimates for individuals on the team or for individual tasks of the story. Some teams are tempted to estimate in ideal days for each individual or group, but you shouldn't do this. That's Mike Cohn's suggestion, at least. The level of focus on the individual roles on a team shifts thinking away from the we're all in this together mentality. So try to estimate how many days is this user story going to take for everybody involved as a chunk of work, not as the individuals working on that chunk of work. With that, you just guess how many days it's going to take, and then you see if you got it right. Fiend. Yeah. That's basically all there is to it. Like I said, I've not used ideal days as a formal metric, and I don't know that I totally agree with it. There's a couple of things with this approach that I've used similar techniques, but they were a little bit different, and I think more effective. So just to start on one of them is when we're talking about, hey, estimate your ideal days, as far as a single user story, not as the individual people working on it or the individual tasks. I've used a technique with teams that was actually the opposite of that suggestion. And what we would do is we would estimate size of user stories holistically with story points. And then we would break down tasks and estimate hours on every task. And that worked out really, really well, actually. It helps you to keep track using a burn down chart, for example, a lot more effectively with the hours remaining on tasks versus story points, because those are blockier units of measurement. And what you see oftentimes in a burn down chart with story points is that, not a whole lot's happening and then drops off. I guess it would go this way to the viewer. So all of a sudden it drops off at the end, and that's when your stuff's getting closed out. It's passing QA, it's getting deployed, it's all happening towards the end of your iteration. And that makes sense because your iteration is a short period of time. You can't just be dropping stuff realistically at a continuous pace. Okay, you need to have some kind of a cadence to that so that you can package production releases in most cases. All right. So I don't know. That worked out really well. The only downside is that it's difficult to get buy-in from your developers or engineering staff on that because it requires them to do tedious time tracking. And people don't like to do that. One of the advantages, I did that while working as kind of like staff augmentation contractor. And one of the advantages of being a contractor is you have to track your billable hours. And so you're already tracking your time. And so it becomes necessary for you to do so. And guess what? That data is actually incredibly useful. All right. Can people lie? Can people fudge the numbers, etc.? Sure. Yeah. But there's already a pretty large margin of error when it comes to agile metrics anyways. These aren't scientific in the sense that like if we were taking these scientific numbers that we collect from agile, you wouldn't want to get on an airplane that had that wide of a margin of error in its engineering principles. Okay, you wouldn't even want that degree of margin of error in the software you deploy because it's just a completely inexact half art, half science thing with zero control. And yeah, your data is going to be pretty murky anyways, to be honest with you. Even though people like to collect it, it's not oftentimes a lot of awesome insights you can gather from that you couldn't just qualitatively get from being insightful and knowing the people on your team and participating in the work that they do. That being said, I'm getting a little off track. Back to ideal days. The other thing I want to comment on is that I have worked on teams, and actually I would say the best team I've worked on. And I've been through several different industries, many different companies. I've had probably over 10 different teams that I've worked with. The one that I think was the best and highest performing team did story pointing with the Fibonacci sequence. However, they would just equate a point value to a number of days that it would take. So in a lot of ways, it wasn't actually ideal days, but it was the elapsed time that they were estimating. And yeah, it worked out beautifully because they were good at what they did. So one of the things about that was that the team was all high-level software engineers. There were very few. Every once in a while, we get someone junior in there, but the core team were very experienced, very good at what they did, and they were very predictable. Like you would give them work, they would get it done. That makes your estimates really nice because then it doesn't really matter that much. When you have a high-performing team like that, they're like, hey, that's going to take me 5 days. They get it done in 5 days. Okay, and it was probably sandbagged a little bit, to be honest. Now, when you have teams that struggle with completing work is when your estimates are starting to become more critical to you because you're going to be working on long-term projects, inevitably. And you're going to need to be able to try to manage the variance. I think that that's probably the biggest point that I want to make here is that teams that are really good at getting work done and they're very predictable, estimates are easy, and you're not gonna have a lot of stress in your life over that kind of stuff. When you have a team that has trouble getting work completed on time is when all of this stuff comes more into play. It becomes more of a lever for you to use to track, what are the things that you're doing to try to improve the team's performance, and is it actually working? And collecting this data is not the way that you get your team to perform better. Collecting this data is the way that you baseline performance so you can see if the things that you had to come up with creatively are working. Right? So this is just tying your shoes. It isn't running the race. That being said, estimating in ideal days, personally, I don't recommend it. It seems weird. And why wouldn't you just do story pointing? It's a lot more commonly used, and you get all the benefits of the relative sizing instead of trying to just estimate how many days it's going to take. With this like weird hoop to jump through of stripping off peripheral activities, what does it matter if it takes me 5 hours to code and test and deploy this thing if it's going to take me 2 weeks to actually accomplish that? I don't see what the point is of finding this hypothetical ideal days. But maybe somebody's used it out there. So if you've found a way that this works or found a reason why this is valuable, please leave a comment. I'd be glad to hear what you have to think about it. So with that, I guess we'll wrap it up. Next up, coming up, just as a preview for chapters 6 and 7, we're going to have story estimating techniques like pointing poker in chapter 6. And then chapter 7 is going to deal with a kind of a classic conundrum. When should I resize my stories? When's it appropriate to do that? When's it not appropriate to do that? So that's going to be a fun one coming up. Anyway, till next time, deuces.